South Africa is in a crime crisis of note. And when it comes to defending yourself in your home, the law isn't always as clear as you might think. Tonight, we're unpacking the reality of self-defense, private defense, the legal risks you could face after surviving an attack, and asking a very powerful question. Should South Africa be looking at something like the Castle Doctrine or not? I'm joined by Sean Lyle from Saga. Let's get right into this. Sean, good morning and welcome back to the channel.
Good morning, Riaan. Thank you for having us back. We've got a particularly important and interesting one today, so I'm very encouraged and thank you for the opportunity.
You, before we jumped off, oh, I like that. You need to do that again. So you
Take
went
one.
Okay. That ought to become a standard part of our videos.
I think so.
I think so.
At least we can laugh about it.
Yes, exactly. Sean, before we kick off with the questions, you said that you would just like to say something about the topic around the Castle Doctrine.
Yes, if I may, I think this is a particularly important one. It is quite technical. It draws on legal jurisprudence in this country. It talks about legality in other countries, and it leans strongly into our constitution. So I think to avoid ambiguity, to make sure that we're clear, the discussion that we're about to have is for public interest. It's to create an informed debate. It's to start a conversation. It is not case-specific legal advice. We're not criminal attorneys, and we do not want to step on the toes of our esteemed colleagues in the criminal defense attorney arena. Rather, we would be speaking as experienced practitioners in our respective fields, lawful firearm owners, and citizens discussing self-defense, specifically for legal clarity in the context of public safety. I believe that what we're going to do, and certainly what I'm going to do, is argue strongly in favor of the Castle Doctrine as a possible development, noting that it is not part of current South African law or self-defense or private defense law. And I think the purpose, certainly from our side, is to examine the concept and the implications and whether this doctrine actually deserves constitutional consideration or legal consideration within the evolution of our South African law. And I think if setting it like that, I think we're in for a very interesting conversation, and we won't have any ambiguity or lack of clarity. So yeah, that's the opening statement I would like to make. Thank you.
All right. So for the viewers, to summarize that, the Castle Doctrine that we will be discussing in this video is not part of our current South African law. Okay, we're discussing it as a potential inclusion because we think it would be worthwhile. And that's the whole aim of this, to get people to hopefully think about this.
Yeah.
All right. Shauna, before we jump into the Castle Doctrine, I want to touch on something else, which I believe is sort of the preamble of the whole thing, and it's much bigger than just that. If the state cannot realistically and reliably protect its citizens from violent attack, then can it justifiably restrict their ability to protect themselves?
I can answer that in a word, and then I'll explain and clarify. And my answer to that very profound and important question would be no. N-O. No, they can't. And the reason I say that is we need to be looking at and considering the limits of state protection versus the limits on self-defense, or what we would refer to as private defense. So I think you put it well. This is far bigger than just a doctrine. This is far bigger, in fact, than even firearms. It's a constitutional principle versus our practical reality. And our constitution enshrines dignity, freedom, and security of the person. And those rights matter the most when someone faces a violent attack, if we talk specifically about violence, in real time. And the state cannot guarantee immediate or complete protection at every moment of danger. It can't do that. Yet violence is immediate. It unfolds, as we know, in seconds, not necessarily minutes. And normally, if it arrives at all, help only arrives much later. In other words, it's what we would call a state-citizen gap. And it's the very reason why we have and have to have private defense in our law at all. So the bottom line, or putting it in different words, is if the state cannot always arrive on time or in time, then it needs to be very, very cautious about restricting lawful means of survival. And I think that is the crux of the debate. And if we put it in a phrase, that phrase would be, and I think we've touched on this before, rights are only tested when they needed the most. And the time you need those rights the most is when you're under violent attack through no fault of your own. So that's how I would frame the answer to that starting question.
So there are a lot of misunderstandings around the idea and the term and the application of private defense in South Africa.
Indeed.
And I think the series that I'm doing with Francois de Kock, the attorney, Legal Talk with Francois, I think the questions and feedback that we get from that series definitely amplifies that thought and shows just how much misunderstanding there is out there.
Yes.
What does the law currently allow when it comes to private defense?
Okay. The first point I would make, if I step to the side slightly, is that we generally, the non-legal or non-attorney firearm owner, from their perspective, they normally talk about self-defense, but the law frames this in the phrase private defense. And what our modern systems acknowledge is this principle of self or private defense rhetorically, yet when it comes to practice, legal presumptions, and we'll talk a lot about legal presumption, leave many victims feeling very uncertain about the actions that they've taken in that extreme moment of danger. Possibly not during it, but certainly in the lead up to it happening, there are these concerns and these nagging worries, and certainly after it's happened. So the criminal act that created the confrontation in the first place, to which they had to apply private or self-defense, often fades into the background while the defensive actions of that person, i.e. victim, become the central legal focus. And that is, I think, the key thing. So the real difficulty here is not what or whether the right exists, because it does, private defense rights, but how its limits are judged after the fact, when you're potentially sitting in a court case months, weeks, days, sometimes years after the actual situation, and then suddenly the rights that you applied are now being judged. So maybe if I may just add a couple of points just briefly to conclude that question about specifically what are the conditions for the use of private stroke self-defense in a South African context. Effectively, there's three, and there's an extension to the third. And these are the three conditions for you as a person to use private defense. Number one, the threat must be unlawful. So that is often causing confusion because people say, well, a threat is always unlawful. What would be a lawful threat? Well, the police lawfully raiding your premises or your home would be a lawful threat. So the threat has to be unlawful, number one. Number two, the attack itself has to be imminent or already in progress. We'll talk a bit later about preemptive. We can't be preemptive, sadly. We have to be under attack when we apply the self-defense. And then most importantly, it often causes a lot of confusion. The force that is used in that situation of self-defense must be 1, necessary, 2, reasonable, and 3, proportionate. Now, those sound great on face value, but they also cause confusion. So in practical terms, what does that mean? What does necessity, reasonability, and proportionate mean? Number one, the force you use must be used to avert, to stop the attack. Number two, it must be reasonable in the circumstances that you find yourself in, and every set of circumstances is different. And so we have to rely on jurisprudence and court cases from the past to look at what that means. And there is a test. I'll maybe touch on that test the court uses. And number three, it has to be directed at the attacker, him or herself. It can't be a general reaction. It has to be directed at the person that is initiating the legal threat against or unlawful threat against you. And in order to try and make sense of this, which can be quite subjective, and it's definitely circumstance-driven, the court will consider, amongst many other things, what is called the reasonable personness test. What would a reasonable person in the same position have done in that set of circumstances? Now, that all sounds interesting. It adds clarity, but that very set of conditions is what causes huge amounts of uncertainty and lack of clarity by people, because it does tend to be, out of necessity, quite subjective.
Well, I mean, if we talk about home invasions, it's chaotic and it's fast, and you have hardly any time to react to this.
Yeah.
In general, people get caught by surprise, which is why so many of these home invasions are successful.
Correct.
So I'm not going to go into measures, that sort of stuff. That's not the point of this conversation. So we often, I mean, it's very real, this legal uncertainty
Yes,
that exists around this whole situation and after what happens after, etc. How realistic is it to expect a textbook legal position in terms of reaction from a homeowner, and in this case, a legal firearm owner, who has just survived a violent attack?
it's not realistic at all. It's expected, but it's not realistic. So what the law needs to do, what the law should do, what the law must do, is recognize our limits, the victim's limits under that extreme stress, and then judge those actions in the context of that extreme stress. So legal theory then uses, and this is where the principle of reasonableness and the reasonableness test comes from, reasonableness and proportionality, to try and judge those events. And these concepts, these principles, are certainly valid. But violent reality, as you've, I think, correctly framed it, is a completely different animal altogether. I mean, people could be asleep in most cases. These things happen at night, disorientated, terrified, unsure whether their weapons are used or not in the dim light that it happens in, unsure whether there's more attackers or not. And home invasions normally have between 3 and 7 attackers. So it's normally very seldom one in a home invasion type situation. It's always multiple, and you don't know where they are. And they then need to make this life-threatening decision or life-changing decision in mere seconds. And therefore, you cannot demand textbook decisions in that nightmare. It's like expecting them to perform legal gymnastics while at the same time confronting their attackers inside their homes, which makes it even more serious. And these judgments that courts are making, obviously, are only making them after the event in what I would refer to as a sterile a court environment, removed from the chaos, removed from the fear, removed from the split-second pressures, rather, of this life-threatening event. And ideally, and the world is not ideal, they should be judged under the circumstances that actually triggered the danger and the circumstances that they are in. But that is not possible despite the rhetoric around it, because it's happening weeks, months, years after the fact. In a case of, as you said, chaos and trauma. So it's not realistic at all, but it's expected. And there sits the problem.
So supporters of castle doctrine are quite vocal about the fact that it would fundamentally change the legal position for South Africans when it comes to defending themselves in their own homes. So what exactly is castle doctrine?
Okay. Now, that is a loaded question. There is a lot involved. We want to try and keep it understandable. We want to try and keep it to the context and the crux of the situation. And we want to be careful of nuances. So let me attempt that, and you rein me in if I'm going too far or not far enough. Number one, this concept of castle doctrine, we find it in most cases in the USA. not in all states, and each state that has it has slightly different definition. It also sometimes goes by the name stand on guard. And in the most recent 2026 situation, which I'm sure we'll touch on, stand your ground, which is a Canadian version of it. Now, the castle doctrine itself and stand on guard are not the same thing. They are slightly different. They're related, but they're not identical. The castle doctrine and stand on guard are similar, whereas stand your ground is slightly different. So we're going to focus on the castle doctrine and stand on guard, the American version and the Canadian version.
Okay.
And what it does is it focuses most specifically on events, situations, attacks inside your home, not outside your home. Stand on guard is slightly different. It relates to more attacks outside of your home, outside of your property, in your vehicle, etc. So we're not referring to that one. It's built on a very simple, logical, rational principle. And I think this is where the starting disclaimer is important, because I would imagine that a lot of people in the country think we have it because it makes so much sense, yet we do not. And that principle is your home is your refuge. In other words, the word castle doctrine comes from that idiom, your home is your castle. That's where it comes from. Now, that is based on long-standing common law and funny enough, English law that ultimately ends up being framed in our South African law. And the reason for this focus on home is that is the place where safety, privacy, and home security or family security should be its strongest. So that is why it's focused on that. If someone violently invades that space, then the law should, the question is, does it? But the law should, in principle, recognize a heightened need for the right to defense, whether it be private defense or self-defense. In those jurisdictions, notably American jurisdictions, where this castle doctrine is codified into law, it often means there is no duty to retreat inside your home when under threat. Now, interestingly enough, one of the defenses raised for private defense in a South African home invasion type context is if you can prove that you retreated inside under threat, that can help you in your case. In other words, you were trying to avoid, not escalate. So it's very interesting that in the castle doctrine, it doesn't require you to retreat. I think most crucially and more importantly is what the doctrine does is it begins from the reality of recognizing that the intruder created the danger. You, as the homeowner, did not ask for this. You did not create the danger. So it recognizes that the intruder created the danger. And where the statutory, and we'll talk about some of the statutory conditions, but where the statutory or legal conditions are met, unlawful and forced entry into an occupied residence, your home, may trigger a presumption that the defender, the victim, the homeowner, acted reasonably unless it is rebutted by the state. Now, that is hugely important. So in the conditions of the castle doctrine, where it's codified, an unlawful entry into an occupied dwelling may trigger a legal presumption that the defender acted reasonably. In other words, we start off by saying the defender is therefore assumed to have acted reasonably unless the state proves otherwise. Now, I would put it, and I mustn't push this too far, but I would put that as a complete 180 degree to the situation we find ourselves in a South African context of self-defense. And that is hugely important. So it creates clearer protection for the lawful victim, the lawful homeowner that is confronting an unlawful intrusion. Now, maybe it would be relevant for me, if I may, give some additional clarity from a castle doctrine point of view of what these statutory conditions mean.
Okay.
And when would the prosecution, the state, possibly rebut this presumption? So the state starts by the doctrine starts by finding that the lawful homeowner is in the right to use defense. And if the state believes that is not the case, they need to prove it, not the other way around. Now, some exceptions to this, just to give maybe some clarity, exceptions include a co-occupant or lawful resident. So if the attacker was a co-occupant or lawful resident, then this presumption is not the case. If it was with regard to a domestic dispute, which sadly we have too many of in this country, then it would not be a presumption of innocence or presumption of right up front. If the defender engaged, the victim was engaging in criminal conduct. So the actual homeowner was conducting in criminal conduct, then it wouldn't be a presumption.
Okay.
If the intruder was law enforcement acting lawfully, we touched on that. So if the police are raiding the property with a just cause, then the Castle Doctrine would not apply. If there was no unlawful forced entry, so forced entry is a particular consideration of the Castle Doctrine, and if the defender was actually the aggressor, so the supposed victim was in fact the aggressor, then this presumption would not hold. So there are guardrails, what I would call guardrails. So those are some of the conditions under the Castle Doctrine. Maybe I need to go a little bit further because this is the crux, I think, of the entire thing, and look at specific South African situation. In other words, what is our status quo, if I may?
Let's do
so
that.
To be clear, as we've said, South Africa law does not currently recognize a codified Castle Doctrine as a distinct legal rule. Our law instead recognizes private defense, which is applied case by case through common law and judicial interpretation. In other words, jurisprudence and looking at the history of it. But the real question for us is, should these principles, i.e. Castle Doctrine principles with their guardrails, be clarified for the unique context of a home invasion? In other words, should we not be seriously considering them, considering we have significant home invasion threats? In other words, if we put this differently, the Castle Doctrine seeks to restore coherence between the law's historic principle, which is where our private defense comes from, and its modern application. So the purpose is not, we need to be clear, is not to encourage violence and escalation. The purpose of the Castle Doctrine is to provide legal clarity where hesitation by the victim could be fatal. So we'll come up with this phrase again, and I'm a strong supporter of this, even though it is quite nuanced. A properly framed Castle Doctrine in the South African context would not be a legal revolution. It would be, in my view, a natural evolution. Because many principles of the Castle Doctrine, many of those principles, although we do not have it codified, those principles themselves form part of our constitutional rights and part of our self or private defense rights. So this, in other words, is not going to be a stretch of the imagination and a figment of someone's imagination for us to seriously consider implementing some of these doctrines for the sake of clarity and to avoid the victim feeling like they are the criminal. Now, that's a long way to answer your very important question, but I think it's very crucial that we give that context. Forgive me, but I think that was quite crucial.
So we'll get to the critics now, because obviously there are critics, but I just want to touch on what I gathered to be a key difference here, which is the burden of proof.
Correct. Correct.
Why does it matter so much, the burden of proof? Why is it so significant whether the defender must justify their actions or whether the state must prove any wrongdoing?
Okay, and I think that you hit it exactly on the head. And the reason why it's so important, and our burden of proof is completely different between us, South African law, private defense, and the Castle Doctrine. Because starting assumptions and starting presumptions actually shape the outcome. They have an influence on the outcome of the case. Where the burden of proof falls, or where it vests, where it sits, can influence, as we see in this country, arrest decisions, charging decisions, prosecutions, and public perceptions of justice. In other words, if the victim, stroke the defender, home defender or victim, must first justify themselves, that person begins this case or this investigation under suspicion. So we start under suspicion. The Castle Doctrine shifts that presumption completely, and I would say 180 degrees, because it recognizes that forced entry into an occupied dwelling may reasonably, in other words, there's a presumption that it may reasonably constitute a deadly threat and therefore open the door to your use of self-defense. So for clarity's sake, and again, we've got to be careful with the nuance and give clarity, Castle Doctrine doesn't eliminate the investigation or accountability for actions taken.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I would say that it actually strengthens it. What it does is it simply moves or places the initial moral and legal force focus where it belongs on the unlawful act. In other words, the person forcefully breaking into your home. And if the state must prove wrongdoing, rather than the victim having to prove wrongdoing, then the law at least recognizes who created the danger in the first place. So if we put that not completely differently, but if we clarify in other words, we have to be very mindful that the legal starting presumption can shape the whole case, because the process itself can become a punishment even when your conduct was lawful. As a victim having been forced to apply self-defense or private defense, the investigation that follows it is in effect a punishment to you or on you for having done what was rightfully your right in the context of law. So it becomes a second trauma. Having gone through the situation itself through no fault of your own, you're now faced with this criminal case where you are having to prove that you didn't act unreasonably. The state starts with the assertion, the presumption that you acted unreasonably and you must now prove your case. The Castle Doctrine starts completely the other way around and says we will presume that you acted reasonably unless we can prove that you didn't based on the circumstances. And that is why that burden of proof is such a critical thing. It may sound very nuanced to some, it may sound like we're splitting hairs, but it is fundamentally different to the way other jurisdictions, including ours, actually start the process. And you mentioned something, if I may, just maybe digress a little. You said there will be detractors. There will be those that are not in favor of the Castle Doctrine. And normally the reason that they're not in favor of it is they see it as a free-for-all license to kill, a license to do what you want automatically. And that is certainly not what the Castle Doctrine is at all. It provides guardrails, it provides conditions, it provides legality, and it continues with the investigation. It just starts, I would say, in the right place. Point one. Point two, when I said a lot of people are confused, and you confirmed a lot of people are confused by this, a lot of people just assume incorrectly that they are in the right when they're defending their home. And then they are very surprised when they come under intense scrutiny in court cases that can cost the very home that they were trying to defend in the costs, because it makes no logical sense. And this is where the statement comes from a number of people in that situation, sadly, where they say, but we feel like the criminal. We feel like we're guilty, but we did nothing wrong. We were defending our own home. And there sits the huge issue with burden of proof.
Okay. Well, I wanted to ask about critics, but I think you've answered that. You've answered that question, because there will always be critics. There are always people who will have whatever reasons, whether it's untoward reasons or legit reasons against proper self-defense. Whether it's just a case of they absolutely do not believe in that because fairies and fairy dust and love and light and stuff, everything criminals do not believe in. The fact is that there are people who feel strong about that. And
can I just touch to interrupt? Sorry to interrupt. Can I just touch on something that maybe gives a little bit of peace of mind to those that are leaning towards a critical assessment of this? Any form of legal reform has to be careful, rational, clear, and responsible. The Castle Doctrine does not undo that. It in fact entrenches that, number one. And number two, it has to be rational, evidence-based, and proportionate. We are not refuting that. So the detractors and the supporters, we have something in agreement, and it's those points. It is those points. Clarity is not extremism. It's definitely not extremism. The major risk we're trying to avoid with the Castle Doctrine under the current system is what is called the defender-offender inversion, which is where the victim feels like they are guilty, and they feel that the offender, the intruder, they feel that the intruder has been given the benefit of the doubt, yet they started this process knowingly in the first place. So that defender-offender, victim-intruder inversion is what the Castle Doctrine is attempting to avoid. In other words, within our law, we often have a situation where the criminal act itself, the forced entry, becomes secondary in the court case, and the victim's use of self-defense becomes the primary focus of scrutiny. And this is where I think you cannot really fault the victim for feeling aggrieved, because they're linking the forced intrusion with their need to enforce self-defense or use self-defense. And they're saying, but now you're going after us criminally, and you're ignoring completely the fact that the intruder was the one that forced the situation. And there sits this inversion that we refer to. The Castle Doctrine tries to add and give clarity to that situation and remove that situation.
I just felt that it was necessary to leave the critics with some constructive food for thought as well. And I trust
absolutely
that in that answer they will find that if they want to.
If they want to, yes.
I'm going to say this, but we all know this. South Africa has scary levels of violent crime. Does this make this debate that we're having more urgent than in safer countries? Do you think the public and maybe policymakers are underestimating just how urgently we need something like the Castle Doctrine?
Absolutely. Absolutely, without any shadow of a doubt. In safer societies, this type of debate feels theoretical. It feels less urgent for all the obvious reasons. In South Africa, we've got an immediate and real problem. So the real issue here is regulation is applied primarily to those, and we see it all the time, it's certainly, at least in perception, to those that obey the law, while criminals ignore the law entirely and appear to have no consequence on them. And what that basically does is create what we would refer to as asymmetric risk, which impacts directly on deterrence. And we've had some chats or upcoming episodes that talk about this whole issue of deterrence. What do we mean? Well, what we know is criminals assess vulnerability, they assess your ability to resist or the target's ability to resist, and therefore the consequences of that. Therefore, if an offender knows that an occupied home may present lawful resistance, i.e. self-defense, backed by clearer legal presumption, which is what the Castle Doctrine attempts to do, that may in fact influence their decision before the crime even begins. In other words, criminals' uncertainty can defer the crime before it's ever used. So the debate here is not about what happens so much during the attack, as horrendous and traumatic as that is, but also what could possibly add to the prevention or deterrence of that attack. In other words, make it less of an idea to go down this road for the criminal. The law shouldn't make easier targets of the innocent, even if they're doing it unintentionally. And under the status quo, in other words, our existing current South African position, even where a person acted lawfully, the process itself is hugely traumatic. In other words, there's a second trauma added on top of the first trauma. This second trauma is what is often referred to as right of bang or the third fight, the legal battle you go through to try and prove yourself innocent and having applied legal force. And that's hectic. That is a hectic situation.
I go so far as to say that there's a third trauma added to that as well, in that you have to suddenly fork out legal costs in order to do so, which is something that you never plan on, and very few people just have that sort of money lying around, so you have to find it somewhere.
Correct,
That in
correct. And that
itself
can
is
cost you your house. In
exactly.
some cases, you actually have to sell your house to fund the legal battle unless you've got obviously provision for it. And you should not have to be in that situation. So you're quite right. There's actually 3 traumas.
So, final question. What principle do you think lawmakers should not lose sight of in this debate?
I would put it in a phrase or 2 words, and then I'll unpack what I mean when I say that. I would say that what the lawmakers, the legislators need to be mindful of is coherence and moral clarity. Because a society that cannot guarantee immediate safety should at minimum, at least guarantee clear legal protection. And we started by saying there's a lot of confusion. So the observation we would make from that is, what clear legal protection do we have if there's so much uncertainty? The real task is to align our historic legal principles with the modern violent reality that we find ourselves in. And it would seem, at least in perception, that violence increases in these situations. We hear more and more stories anecdotally about that than decreases. So the lawmaker needs to be mindful that we are not arguing for changes in the principles of self-defense. What we are asking for, what we are arguing for, what we are motivating is clearer protection to the lawful citizen when they need it most. And why would we be doing that? I think that the reasons are obvious, because the consequence of legal misunderstanding, legal uncertainty is hesitation. And we know from chats we've had and the experts you've had on your channel, hesitation takes time, and in violent confrontation, time can cost lives. So the lawmakers need to be mindful of that. And how would they do that? By keeping the law or making the law more coherent. That's where I start with the phrase coherence and moral clarity, to recognize who created the danger in the first place. And who is forced to respond under duress of that situation. So the Castle Doctrine is less of a revolution than it is of a rational evolution, and the foundation already exists in our self-defense jurisprudence. The law should stand presumptively, at least at the start of the investigation or the court case, with the innocent occupant, and not give what many people perceive to be an unfair advantage to the intruder, the person causing the problem in the first place. So I would say coherence and moral clarity, and I would frame it with all of those points. That is what they should be bearing in mind. And the question then is, are they? Are they? We leave that as a rhetorical question to the viewer, to the firearm owner, to the home defender, to the victim, potential victim or past victim. Does the law actually give you that comfort and confidence? Rhetoric statement.
When someone breaks into your home, there is no time to think about law. There is basically only survival. But when it's over, the real questions inevitably begin. Will you be seen as the victim, or will you be seen as the suspect? Think about that, because one day it might actually not be theoretical. If you like the video, please click the like button. Please subscribe to the channel, and please smash that bell icon for us so that you can get notifications of new videos coming out. As always, if you're interested in any of the training offered under the Lone Operator and Fortis Proactive Defense Solutions, there is a link in the description below. Check that out. We look forward to seeing you on a range one of these days. Sean, thank you so much for spending time with us. Highly appreciate it, as always.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you for allowing us to make a case for this specific doctrine. Thank you for that.